This is a video response to Violently Graceful, who made a response to my video, The Problem of Pain. I made that video a couple days ago as my artistic expression of my views on the problem of evil. In my opinion, the problem of evil is one of the least compelling arguments against the existence of God. In my view, it's extremely useless. The only use I see for the problem of evil is using it as an argument against God's benevolence. That's the only use I see for that argument. Now, I made my video, and Violently Graceful made a video objecting some of my arguments. And I'm going to address them here. I'll start with this first point. I'll start with this first point here, and I'll quote it. I understand your point of view. I think there is some solace to be had in that, and that there's somebody out there who's looking out for everybody, and is going to make everything better. But saying there are no reason for pain and suffering to exist if a benevolent God doesn't exist is like saying that there's no reason for death to exist if there isn't an afterlife. I think this is approaching this the wrong way. It makes more sense to me that the idea of a benevolent God and the idea of an afterlife may make dealing with the realities of pain, suffering, and death easier for certain people. End quotes. Now, there's a lot there, so I'm going to tackle this one step at a time. I'll start with this statement first. Quote, saying there's no reason for pain and suffering to exist if a benevolent God doesn't exist is like saying there's no reason for death to exist if there isn't an afterlife. End quote. Okay. The problem here is that you are equivocating the God concept with the idea of death, which are two completely different things. Two different concepts. For this comparison to even be valid, you have to adjust by what you mean by the term death. Because without defining what you mean by the term death, it makes your statement feel like a false comparison. You neither define the term God nor the term death. This is the very same point I criticized Professor Anton on. But to be fair, I'm going to assume you are thinking about the Christian conception of God, which is interrelated with the afterlife concept. Again, this does not hurt my point because you are equivocating the word God with the word death without defining either. Do you mean death as in death in the physical body and the consciousness survives? Or the death of the physical body and the death of all consciousness, or a soul, if you want to put it that way? Even if I were to grant you your statement, you have not shown how there being no reason for suffering to exist if a benevolent God does exist is on par with saying there's no reason for death to exist if there is no afterlife. In fact, I would go as far as to suggest that statement itself is contradictory. The reason being is because the term afterlife, or life after death, implies there is such a thing as death. If there's no such thing as death, then it doesn't make sense to say whether or not that life after death exists, if death doesn't exist. That in effect would make the term life after death, or afterlife, completely meaningless as a term. Alright, that's my first response to your first point. I'm going to move on to your next one. Quote, it makes more sense to me that the idea of a benevolent God and the idea of an afterlife may make dealing with the realities of pain and suffering and death easier for certain people. End quote. My response to this can be both ways. If this statement is meant to be as an argument that God doesn't exist, then it doesn't work because that could be the case and God would still exist. But I don't think that's where you're going with this. I think what you're trying to get at is that because some people cannot handle the reality of pain and suffering, they need to believe in some sort of higher power in order to even function. But this point does not show whatsoever that this kind of reliance on a belief, keyword, belief in a higher power is unwarranted in trying to overcome the problem of suffering. I really don't see where you're going with this. Alright. In my description box, I had claimed that we as a mankind are corrupt to the core, and without a benevolent God, there is no reason for there to be pain and suffering. You object to this by stating the following, and I quote, there are a couple problems with this because it denies humanity's role in this. The first is it refuses to allow us to take credibility for the progress we have made as a species. In about 3,000 years, we have come a pretty long way, and there are a lot of things we've done in the past considered good or commanded by God, even that today we don't like anymore. We consider them wrong, like slavery, for example. We know better, but we can't acknowledge that, can we? We have to give God credit for that. Okay, couple of points. While you are correct that we have come a long way within the last 3,000 years, That does not change the fact that even with the advancement of technology and moving more and more away from different customs and different ways of living, that completely ignores the fact that there is still suffering in this world. There are still wars, famines, genocides, and so on and so on. What does society making progress over the last 3,000 years have to do with this? I'll give you a couple examples of what I mean. During World War II, we dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Our own military sprayed Agent Orange on our own soldiers during the Vietnam War. During the Bush administration, during the Iraq War, we had horrible incidents at Abu Ghraib prison where prisoners of war were waterboarded and tortured. We still have genocidal conflict going on in places like Africa and the Middle East. People in third world countries are not getting any food or water, or the necessary medical treatment that they need, even though we now have this huge advancement in technology at our disposal. Now, if what you're saying is true about mankind coming a long way, then it shouldn't be the case that there will be any suffering, or that the amount of suffering has lessened. But there is suffering, there is pain, there is evil. When this argument is presented, the one I'm trying to present, people will bring up objections similar to yours by stating, but look at all the progress we have made as a species. But this is irrelevant. It completely misses the point of the argument. Now, before I move on from this, I want to bring attention to a statement you slipped in there, and it's this. We know better, but we can't acknowledge that, can we? We have to give God credit for that. You're very clever for saying this. However, this statement is assuming that we don't acknowledge our own accomplishments because we put our belief in God above ourselves. It's never implied that mankind cannot acknowledge that we, as a species, have progressed over the last 3,000 years or so. The problem is that you are confusing the idea of putting God above everything else with giving every accomplishment that has made credit to God. Nowhere does it say that we can't be proud of our accomplishments, or give credit to our own accomplishments. That's not the point of the argument whatsoever. You are reading things into the argument that are simply not there. I'll explain this further when I respond to your next point. Your next point is this, and I quote. And the negative thing is that saying we can't do anything to try to eliminate the problem of suffering is that it absolves humans of the responsibility to do whatever they can to alleviate the problem. My response is that this has nothing to do with whether or not it denies mankind's responsibility to alleviate the problem of suffering. In fact, you are correct in saying that humans do have a responsibility to alleviate the amount of suffering there is. The problem is not that it eliminates humans of their responsibility to do so. It's just that mankind cannot be trusted to alleviate it by themselves. Again, I can give plenty of examples of this. My main point is that mankind cannot be trusted to alleviate the problem by themselves. Now, you may argue that there are people who don't believe in God may be able to help alleviate the problem of suffering. And I would argue that you would be correct. But the problem is that how can you be sure that man is able to alleviate the problem without some sort of belief in higher power or belief in a higher power? How do you know that man's reliance on themselves to alleviate the problem of suffering will prevail? Man has proven time and time again that they continue to fail in living up to their standards of morality, their own standards of righteousness in order to overcome the problem of suffering. Again, I can give plenty of examples of this. By looking towards a benevolent, sovereign God, we are basically seeking help from a being that is greater and higher than ourselves. A being that is sovereign and benevolent, that would be a standard that we seek to strive for. When I say that the problem of suffering cannot be overcome without the presence of a benevolent God, and there is no reason for suffering to exist if there is no benevolent God, what I mean is the presence of a benevolent sovereign God is what helps us to truly overcome our own human inadequacies. Whether or not you want to argue that it's merely driven by a belief in God is beside the point. What we are saying is because man is incapable of overcoming the problem of pain by himself, that he needs to look to some sort of higher standard than man is even capable of. Even if I were to grant you that a non-believer can try to achieve overcoming the problem of suffering without the help of a benevolent God, it is because of their corrupt nature that they will fail time and time again, and will continue to go into repetition of constant failures at overcoming the problem of suffering in order to try and save themselves. We are as humans selfish and corrupt, and to even try and overcome suffering without seeking the help without seeking the help of a sovereign God, or with the belief in a sovereign, benevolent God that is higher than ourselves, will just, at least in my opinion, lead more failures and no success, or barely any success whatsoever, in overcoming and being able to cope with suffering. Now, the last point you made is that you suggest that because people will want to pray to a God for help in order to become suffering, they'll just rely on God's help and just lay back and be lazy and let God do all the work. Now, to be fair, you did suggest this wasn't what I was getting at. However, to even suggest that is a possible argument on my part is unnecessary. To me, this seems more like a cheap shot at my point than anything else rather than a valid argument. The reason is because it does not follow whatsoever that because someone would try and reach out for God for help in a time of pain and suffering, that means they would believe they should be lazy and let God do all the work and believe everything is going to be okay. Because, and according to you, these people believe that the world is going to hell anyway in a handbasket, and Jesus is coming, so we don't have to worry. But you are expressing an extreme minority viewpoint that the majority of Christians, heck, even anyone who believes in a benevolent God, do not hold to. All this is reading this view into an argument, reading something into the argument that's not there. Okay. Anyway, I hope that answered your objections, even if you don't agree with the conclusion. Anyway, thanks for the video. Thanks for your time. You have a good day. Take care.